Um, Good evening and good afternoon. Welcome. My talk to my talk today is on the Northeastern post-American Revolutionary War era states and the weird, uncanny fiction and folkloric writing that developed in those regions. There's often an overlap between fiction and folkloric writing, much of which is fictional. Um, by folkloric writing, I mean that which purports to be placed in New York, New England, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, especially in the early years, 1775 through 1778, there was heavy fighting from New York through Pennsylvania. Um, this resulted in a lot of intense intercolony fighting, much of which created bad blood, which resonated well after the war's end on September 3rd, 1783. Even when the bigger battles in the North were subsiding, New York continued to have regional violence and brutal warfare on its frontier. New York also had higher crime rates during those years than the surrounding areas, which may have be because of they had such a diversity of populations there, even during the war years. Most of the upstate Native American population had been removed, as well as landholding loyalists. There's a huge influx at that time of New Englanders entering New York. In In Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the schoolmaster Ichabod Crane is introduced as a native of Connecticut, where I'm reading from, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers of the mind as well as for the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodmen and country schoolmasters. There's expansionism and much more population turnover. Due to the lifting of British restrictions, the Western territories are opened up. There's a lot more moving around and exploration, and more individuals turn up who are not part of family or established neighborhood communities. Then they may leave. One frequent trope in literature of the uncanny are peddlers and or gypsies who appear to sell the wares and then disappear only to turn up later in some ghostly ethereal form, or possibly their mortal remains are found interred in the world of a long-standing tavern or someone's home. Get this. Oh, and of course, I wanted to put up some art of that era. This is a little later. This is Thomas Cole, The Clove, and this is The Fall of the Catterskill, Thomas Cole, 1826. Um, so, starting in the early 19th century, there's big changes in transportation modes, which greatly increases traffic on the Hudson River. The newly invented steamboat made its first trip in 1807, traveling from New York to Albany. Um, and the Erie Canal opened in 1825, which connects the Hudson to the country's interior and completely transforms the river into one of the busiest thoroughfares in the country. There is a turnover from quiet, small agrarian communities into more industrialized urban environs, which in turn attracts people from other states and immigrants, and ultimately culminates in rather intense mixes of temperament and cultures. Throughout the 19th century, these migrations tremendously alter the regional life of the communities throughout the central to downstate New York areas, obviously more so the closer to get to New York City. At the same time, there's shifts in social status, concepts such as gentleman are replaced by citizen or Mr. Professions start to take on more social value than hereditary lineage, and probably having something to do with their participation in the war through the concept of Republican motherhood, women's roles in raising educated, virtuous, and productive citizens take on more value. A new, more diverse middle class does begin making inroads into society, and educational opportunity does grow, and of course, the literacy rates are then higher. There's the burgeoning printing industry, which is pamphlets, newspapers, journals, small booklets. Charles Brockden Brown, who we will get to shortly, is putting out the printed word. He writes for or creates 4 new journals on history and current events. Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, and many others are contributing to the periodical scene. Then there's the ongoing slavery issue to be dealt with. The North begins abolishing slaveholding through gradual emancipation acts passed by individual states. Pennsylvania is the first in 1780, with most northern states doing so by the 1820s. In the southern states, slavery becomes more deeply entrenched. The Constitution protects the slave trade, thus anticipating unsettled battles and bloodshed and great strife to come. That's later in the century, obviously. There's also big changes in religious freedom as the Anglican Church is destabilized, and thus resulting in the separation of church and state. There are also anxieties about expansionism and an awareness of populations not that far away who are unfamiliar. The confluence of all of these changes undoubtedly contributes to the vast folklore in these regions. This is from Washington Irving, one of his collections of essays. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood, he's talking about the Hudson River Valley, by the way, the neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population in most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarce had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out of a night to walk the rounds, they have no acquaintance left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts, except in our long-established Dutch communities. Correction, that is actually a paragraph from early in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which we will revisit later. Before we go, here we go. Oh, here's an image of a Yankee peddler from Thomas Waterman Wood, 1872. Okay. And here is Charles Brockden Brown. Okay, and here's some of his titles. I will go, just stay with me here. Before we go into the post-revolutionary texts of the weird and uncanny, I want to mention the immense popularity of the very popular key British imports, Horace Walpole, whose Castle of Otranto remains a foundational and defining text, Anne Radcliffe, who wrote The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, and The Italian, 1797, among other best-selling works. There's a term, Radcliffean, which means texts with supernatural elements, which are always resolved logically in the end. And Matthew Gregory Lewis's very shocking and sensational The Monk, 1796. Charles Brockden Brown was influenced by radical British philosophers. He read William Godwin, who was the father of Mary Shelley, and his novel, Caleb Williams, is considered to have heavily influenced Brown's own prose style. And he also read Ben Franklin. He is actually mentioned in Mr. Franklin's autobiography. So, okay, and here's several copies of Wieland, which has been in print since it was first published in the late 18th century, 1798. So we now arrive at is what widely considered to be the first true American Gothic novel, which is Wieland. It's published in 1798 and set on a secluded estate near the Schuylkill River, just outside of Philadelphia. Let's first have a little background about Brockden Brown himself. He had a short life. He was born in Philadelphia on January 17th, 1771, and died February 22nd, 1810, also in Philadelphia. I'm actually going to take the liberty of reading from my copy of Wieland for his biography because I liked what they had to say. This was simple. He was born into a Quaker family in Philadelphia in 1771, just 6 years before the Declaration of Independence. He was one of 6 siblings. He was physically weak, and he died in 1810 of the tuberculosis that had afflicted him throughout his life. But by all accounts, he was an adventurous, strong-willed young man, hardworking and considerate. He lived through a key turning point in history. Philadelphia was one of the largest cities in the world, an exciting melting pot of culture and politics, and the site of all major Congress decisions in the newly independent country. The Declaration was signed here on July 4th, 1776. During his life, the new America broke its ties to colonial Europe with the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and wrestled with blockades, naval wars, and treaties, which served to firm the new America's resolve to grow strong and economically independent in a complicated war-infested world. By the early 1790s, Brown had moved to New York, which had rapidly become a political and cultural nexus. With only 5 million residents compared to the 11 million of Britain and 29 million of France, new Americans were rapidly developing their own socio-economic philosophies against a background of revolution and war in Europe, which complicated all forms of nation-state relationships. Brown and his friends in the New York scene of literary and political intellectuals published furiously in journals, books, newspapers, and letters which helped shape the direction of the new America. So that's by Jake Jackson, who created the notes for this edition. This is Flame Tree Press. It's a small British press that releases a lot of these horror titles. I love small presses and their graphics too. So let's see. Here we go. He called himself a storytelling moralist. He created and wrote for several early journals that grew out of the developing society. He advocated for and wrote about penal reform and the abolition of slavery and other causes of that era, all while living against the background of European and American Revolution, the Native American conflicts, and the yellow fever epidemic in Philly in 1793, also known as the American Plague Year, and other yellow fever outbreaks, including in New York City. In his 1799 novel, Arthur Merwin, he references the contagion victims he has seen. His protagonist sees apparitions and fleshless faces as he wanders through Philadelphia. He also wrote a few very other intense novels. He intentionally strove to create an American variation of the enormously popular and influential British Gothic novels of the day, which were very popular and in demand in the US of the time, and continue to be. His interest was in finding fear and menace in the largely unsettled and vast spaces in the American landscape, the spaces that can conceal and at the same time magnify fear and horror. Instead of castle ruins, ancient families with hidden secrets, mad monks, and the ghost of long-dead titled relatives, Brown focused on the American frontier, Indian conflicts, contagion, and endless open spaces. Over 80% of Americans worked on farms. Brown's fiction of farmhouses, broad streets, and quiet provincial solitary churches spoke to them. In the preface to his 1799 novel, Edgar Huntley, or Memoirs of a Sleepwalker, he writes, "Puerile superstition and exploded manners, Gothic castles, and chimeras are the materials usually employed for this end. The incidents of Indian hostility and the perils of the Western wilderness are far more suitable, and for a native of America to overlook these would admit of no apology." Again, and here you have all of the different covers that have been released over the years. So this is a corker of a book. So it's a really wild read. I first read it in high school and I just revisited it. So Wieland, or The Transformation, an American Tale, published in 1798 when Brown was 27, is set in the 1760s and 1770s, which spans the period between the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, and the beginning of the American Revolution. It is a compendium of bizarre events set against a multi-generational plot. Brockton Brown weaves together a wild and mysterious natural environment, a male protagonist convulsed with religious fervor, and a semi-oldish family history. Because while the country was newly created, the colonists had been there for a while. Wieland is full of bizarre psychological and possibly supernatural events, or maybe divine intervention is involved. Who knows? The list includes, but is not limited to, spontaneous human combustion, disembodied voices coming from empty closets and blank walls, evil ventriloquism, filicide, uxoricide, suicide, religious fanaticism, a mass murderer who escapes from imprisonment to continue the killing he believes God has commanded him, and endless paranoia permeates the whole narrative. Uh, you're not going to feel upbeat as you're reading this book. The writing of Wieland is stylistically late 18th century. Um, Let me read a few sentences of the first chapter. Uh, this is very different writing that we see later on with Jane Austen, especially in her brilliant Northanger Abbey, which of course satirizes the Gothic novels of the popular Gothic texts of the day, or Mary Shelley's eternally popular Frankenstein, which comes out in 1818. Um, this is Clara, who narrates the entire book, the sister of Theodore Wieland. Uh, this is the second generation that's covered in this book. I feel little reluctance in complying with your request. You know not fully the cause of my sorrows. You are a stranger to the depth of my distresses. Hence your efforts at consolation must necessarily fall. Yet the tale that I am going to tell is not intended as a claim upon your sympathy. In the midst of my despair, I do not disdain to contribute what little I can to the benefit of mankind. I acknowledge your right to be informed of the events that have lately happened in my family. Make what use of the tale you shall think proper. If it be communicated to the world, it will inculcate the duty of avoiding deceit. It will exemplify the force of early impressions and show the immeasurable evils that flow from an erroneous or imperfect discipline. My state is not destitute of tranquility. The sentiment that dictates my feelings is not hope. Futurity has no power of my thoughts. To all that is to come, I am perfectly indifferent. With regard to myself, I have nothing more to fear. Fate has done its worst. Henceforth, I am callous to misfortune. Clara is, throughout the course of the novel, you're she could be considered an unreliable narrator. Or you could be thinking that, wow, um, Charles Brockton Brown leaves, creates a lot of errors on purpose, or he's trying to confuse the reader. So, or then you start to think, well, maybe the narrator is not completely honest, or does she herself believe what she's telling us? So, so, um, the basic plot of Wieland is inspired in part by a farmer who killed his wife and children upstate New York in 1781 and claimed it was because spirits with a religious bent told him to do so. There's also another familicide in the Northeast around the same time, which Brockton Brown probably was aware of, and I believe also may have been in his mind when he penned Wieland. A lot of people have written about him seem to think that he was aware of that other. I mean, news did not get around back then the way it does now, obviously. So this plot of Wieland that he's using, the farmer who did kill his family, uh, Brockton Brown would have learned about it considerably later. So then when it happened, obviously. Um, the novel is narrated by Clara Wieland as she looks back at the endless horrors that have beset her family. Years before, her father, a religious fanatic, built a temple out on the Pennsylvania frontier with the goal of converting Native Americans. This doesn't work out as he had planned. He then dies by spontaneous combustion for what was believed to be a punishment for violating a vow to God. He's literally found quite burned up. Uh, Later on, the younger Wieland, who also tends towards religious extremism and desperately wants to be in direct contact with the Almighty, believes that if ventriloquist words come directly from God, and he rapidly descends into insanity and murders his wife and children. Clara herself is sometimes an unreliable and disordered narrator. She takes a long time in getting to her themes, with one untrustworthy character having converted to Catholicism years before he enters the storyline. Brockton Brown does excel at creating a growing environment of fear for his characters and a sense of mistrust over what their own senses are conveying. The two themes that seem to dominate in Wieland are, one, religious fanaticism and the trouble and destruction it can cause. And the other theme is seems to be how much can you trust what you yourself are seeing and hearing? And can you trust the people around you to be what they appear to be? Uh, Hence, there is some anti-Catholicism in one of the characters who seems untrustworthy, is described as having converted a number of years ago in Europe to Catholicism. So Brown did not write very much about his own writing, so several things in his works are left for the reader to interpret. He was an influence to Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Percy and Mary Shelley, among others. He is not for the faint of heart, but Wieland, while featuring a fair amount of violence, is his most accessible and popular novel. It does not appear to have ever been out of print since its original publication. Uh, Chapter 19 is basically the key to the whole story and has been featured in a few horror and gothic short story anthologies. So I came across it years ago in my middle school library, thinking, all right, this looks interesting. It was definitely interesting. And it was really intensely scary, actually. Probably shouldn't have been available. But anyway, this novel will definitely leave you with a feeling of unease. Oh, and here's more editions. Okay, these are the writers who I think these were switched around. That's okay. Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, and Matthew Gregory Lewis, whose Gothic novels were so popular in their day and were big bestsellers in the U.S. So, okay, and here's the Mysteries of Udolpho, interspersed with some pieces of poetry by Anne Radcliffe, Volume 1. Mm. Oh, okay. This is moving on to Washington Irving, who we're going to get to now. Washington Irving was the 11th child born in Manhattan to a prosperous merchant family on April 3rd, 1783, the year the Revolution ended. So, and this is a painting that he had commissioned of him meeting George Washington as a child, which I will get to in a moment. His mother named him after George Washington, and he got to meet his namesake at age 6 when Washington visited New York just before his inauguration as president in 1789. The story is that General Washington had run to the store on an errand, and the Irving family servant saw him and inquired if she could run back and fetch Washington Irving. George Washington obliged them, and the meeting shortly took place. Irving later had a watercolor made to commemorate the meeting. It hangs in his famous home of Sunnyside to this day. Sunnyside was the custom-built home he had made sometime in the 1840s, where he lived out his life pretty much in Tarrytown, New York. So his family had the means to raise him in relative comfort, and he was sent upstate to Tarrytown in the Hudson River Valley during periods of yellow fever outbreak, wherein he became enchanted with the wild natural beauty, Dutch customs, and folklore. He used the Tarrytown setting for the legend of Sleepy Hollow, which technically did not become Sleepy Hollow until North Tarrytown changed its name in 1996. It's a huge tourist hub if anyone has been there, and it is very pretty, and you have great views of the Hudson. Um, he took long walks into Westchester County as a youth, and he had loved exploring the whole area. He had great interest in the maritime life around the Hudson River and hung around the wharves in his lower Manhattan neighborhood, watching the ships and absorbing the culture of the seamen. He wanted to go to sea and become a sailor, but his family discouraged it. So, on other teenage trips along the Hudson, he explored the Catskills mountain area where he later set Rip Van Winkle. In his author's account of himself, he says, "My holiday afternoons were spent in rambles around the surrounding country. I made myself familiar with all of its places famous in history or fable. I knew every spot where a murder or robbery had been committed or a ghost seen. To the great disgust of his devout Scotch Presbyterian father, he was not a great or engaged student, Although in the family's efforts to get him into the legal field, he did meet and become engaged to Matilda Hoffman, the daughter of Judge Josiah Hoffman, under whom Irving had studied law. Tragically, she died before they could marry. Irving was heartbroken, ultimately never married. Um, Given his success and how well traveled he was in his lifetime, it is interesting that he never remarried, but that he never married. Um, when he was 19, he began writing social and theater commentary for the New York Morning Chronicle under the pseudonym Jonathan Oldstyle. Aaron Burr had founded the paper, and he liked Irving's writing. He sent samples of it to his daughter and around town for to promote Irving. Um, they became friends, and then in 1807, Irving covered the infamous Burr trial, Burr killing Hamilton. Um, Charles Bracton Brown traveled to New York City with an eye towards recruiting Jonathan Oldstyle for a literary magazine he was editing in Philadelphia. Due to concerns over Irving's health, his more business-oriented brothers financed a European grand tour from him from 1804 to 1806, where he very much, in his own words, longed to wander over the scenes of renowned achievement, to tread, as it were, in the footsteps of antiquity, to loiter about the ruined castle, to meditate on the falling tower, to escape, in short, from the commonplace realities of the present and lose myself among the shadowy grandeurs of the past. A lot of his future stories and essays are set in Europe, and he returned there many times and many more times during his lifetime, including living there from 1815 to 1832 while trying to salvage the family's trading company and serving under two presidents as an ambassador to Spain in the 1840s. Um, while he was living in England in the teens, he published the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, which was serialized from 1819 to 1820 and was a huge success on both sides of the Atlantic and brought him fame and tremendous recognition. He is arguably the US's first writer to achieve an international level of recognition. Um, he a lot of the stories in the sketchbook are set in, they're essays about life in England, and they're very readable. I mean, we'll get to his two classic texts momentarily, but he has um, he has a lot of stuff, what I call domestic information about how people lived. He visited churches and abbeys, and he socialized with the literati of the day, and he knew Sir Walter Scott pretty well. Sir Walter Scott actually helped him get published. He obviously, from his writing, did miss New York and the Northeast, but he seems to have been very settled and happy in England too. So, so he wrote and published for the rest of his life and was extremely prolific, but he never quite reached the level of success again as he did with the sketchbook. Although his essays and several of his short stories, which are again overall very well written, have stayed in print. He wrote biographies. He wrote a multi-volume biography of George Washington, which he finished 8 months before his death at 76 in Sunnyside, his home in Tarrytown. He was also a big advocate for tougher laws and protections for writers from copyright infringement, which anticipates later efforts by Dickens and other writers of that era. He did know Dickens, by the way. He met Dickens when Dickens was in New York sometime in the 1840s. So they did have something of a connection. He wrote a biography, again, multi-volume biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and he also wrote a multi-volume biography of Christopher Columbus. And Irving is, to me, in many ways, a myth maker. And it's not just because of his two iconic texts, Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. He is the person who I think probably started a lot of the mythology, the modern day mythology that most of us grew up with about Christopher Columbus. He he focused when he was writing his biography of Columbus on a small group of, they basically were the Flat Earth Society, and they did not believe the planet was round. Most people did not think that the earth was flat in those days. But Irving did put out that story, and it did take on a life of its own. And it probably is the basis of how Columbus has been taught, was taught for many years, as this groundbreaking conqueror and explorer who discovers that the earth is round. So he created other myths as well. I mean, a lot of his terminology is in play today. He created the term Gotham for New York, which I think is sometimes used derogatorily to imply a darkness and a crime-ridden city. Um, he he was very genial and well liked. He strikes me as having been a go along to get along person on the surface. He does seem like his family, his brothers did, watch over and control his movements a lot. But at the same time, he did seem to have a great deal of will because he created all of his, he kept writing his entire life. So, um, anyway, so I just wanted to segue into that. Let me move forward a little here. Oh, this is Rip Van Winkle. Okay, which is Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I don't have to tell you, are hugely popular, hugely popular in culture and have been since they first appeared. This is just one of many covers of Rip Van Winkle. Here's Dame Van Winkle and presumably Rip's dog. Oh, and we'll get to this in a minute. This is the PBS fairy tale series from the 1980s that was narrated by Shelley Duvall. And these episodes are actually worth looking at. I watched this one last week. This is Harry Dean Stanton playing Rip Van Winkle, and this is when he first wakes up. And this is directed and put together by Francis Ford Coppola of the Godfather fame. There is his sister, wonderful Talia Shear, playing Dame Van Winkle, who, as someone said, can they do something with her hair? And there's Tim Conway playing one of the people who is who is post-revolution in Rip Van Winkle, who appears when Rip makes his reappearance after his 20 years nap. So okay. The sketchbook stories are told through Irving's fictional narrator, Geoffrey Crayon, who is a Knickerbocker to his core, which is a term that was popularized by Irving, but it is an old term. It refers to the early Dutch settlers of New York. Uh, First off, Washington Irving is satirical. He's a satirist. He is somewhat comical. He's trying to be comical and entertaining. There is, though, an underlying seriousness and breadth of history that runs through his two most famous stories, Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Both stories strongly reference recent historical events and events farther back in time. Um, the following is a quote from the Penguin Edition's Rip Van Winkle footnotes. Irving's immediate source for Rip Van Winkle was the German folk tale Peter Klaus, the story of a goat herder who sleeps for 20 years after a mysterious draught of wine. But the story also offers a meaningful commentary on the impact, or lack thereof, of the transition from monarchical to democratic government in the United States. So, yeah, his story, Rip Van Winkle, is not originally his story. So, but it does have a lot of American history in it, and he does make it his own. Um, Despite its indebtedness to German source material, Rip Van Winkle is a vibrantly written story which transcends its allegorical basis. It is obviously very much an allegory with and Rip Van Winkle is the colony. Uh, Dame Van Winkle is England imposing their will over the poor, rather clueless colonialists and so on. But it does transcend that it wouldn't be as popular as it was if it was just an allegory. It is there, the writing makes it very rich. So, as in keeping with much of the fiction of the day, the tale is reported as a recovered text, a posthumous writing from Irving's earlier comic historian Dietrich Knickerbocker. This in the initial setting before the Revolution, the inn where Rip hides from his wife has a picture of King George on the sign, add to the sense of a long ago fairy tale. Um, the country is described as yet a province of Great Britain, and Rip is a good-natured descendant of the Winkles, who figured so gallantly in hothead chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant and accompanied him to the siege of Fort Christina. Rip, alas, has inherited little of the martial character of his ancestors. The great era in Rip's character is an insufferable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. He has little luck in fishing. He complains that it's useless to work on his farm. It was the most pestilential little piece of ground in the whole country. Everything went wrong and would go wrong in spite of him. He has seemingly no problem in running errands for all of the good wives of his village, all of whom greatly favor Rip over Dame Van Winkle and devote endless time to gossiping to how awful Dame Winkle is to poor Rip. So he's also very popular with the village children who follow him around. Stray dogs follow him, and of course his own devoted dog Wolf, who talk about devotion, waits 20 years for his return. He's been in the same wooden house for 20 years. One has to think that the neighbors are feeding him or he's getting food somehow or other. That's a very old dog to live 20 years. So, but he is there when Rip returns. So ultimately, Dame Van Winkle uh, just starts to really bear down on him, of course, and he takes off instead of for the tavern, which is probably closed for the day. He takes off with his gun and dog in tow to the mountains, basically the woods, the Catskill Mountains. He's approached by a singular personage, a short, squat vision of long ago who is dressed in the bygone era of a long ago person. He's carrying a keg, and Rip, who doesn't seem to have much of a will of his own, follows him deep into the heart of the Catskill Mountains, where they come upon the company of odd-looking personages playing nine pins, who remind Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting brought over the time of the settlement. Of course, he drinks from their flagon endlessly and falls asleep. He returns to his he when he awakens, his beard is down to his knees and his dog is gone. So, and he just gets up and returns home, basically. He doesn't even, he seems a little put out at first. He returns to his village, and of course, in Irving's vibrant, extremely entertaining prose, we learn that Rip has slept through the American Revolution. He's quite the attraction for his old and new fellow villagers, and almost gets into real trouble when he blesses the king. He's really in for a shock of existential anxiety when he spots his double, who is an almost perfect double of long ago Rip, which, of course, is his son, um, who in a number of film versions is portrayed as being kind of as sedentary and lazy as Rip is. But anyway, so he ultimately, though, all is restored when Rip learns that his wife has died, in Irving's words, but a short time since. She broke a blood vessel in a fit of passion at a New England peddler. Once it's learned she's dead, Rip seems to settle down considerably, and he resumes his easygoing lifestyle very quickly. The line, Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of states and empire made but little impression on him, but there was one species of despotism under which he had long groaned, and that was petticoat government. So, thus, in my words, Rip is able to return to his normal life and peace is restored. It's seemingly because his Dame Winkle is gone. Um, so, obviously, we've most likely all read this story and we've probably read different versions of it from childhood on. So, I remember thinking when I was very young, wow, this seems like very bad thing. This guy's going to sleep away his life. I took it as a warning that you want to, not do that, and you want to keep moving forward, not sleep. So as I got older and I started going, through school trips and with my parents to all the Revolutionary War and New York and American history museums and in, uh, you know, civil, reenact uh, places that were kept intact from the past. Like Old Bethpage, for example, had a recreation of Revolutionary War life. As I started going through it, I started thinking again about Rip Van Winkle. I started thinking, well, no, the man slept through the Revolutionary War. That's pretty powerful. Then, upon revisiting Rip Van Winkle all these years later, I've come to the conclusion that yes, Washington Irving is really focusing on all the politics of his day. But yeah, it does seem to be that Rip went away to get away from his wife. He took a little revolution of his own, a little powder of his own, and took off. And he can safely return when she's gone. So that's my own. I think everyone has their own interpretation. I mean, it is first and foremost a comic story too. So, and I think the soldiers, I mean, the ghosts of the soldiers, because that's what they appear to be, that appear in Rip's Dream are probably the closest Irving ever does come to actually to creating supernatural imagery. I think most of his stories, if not all, are ultimately grounded in reality, but he always gives you a little wink, wink to say, hey, this might be supernatural, this may not be supernatural. So, um, let's move on here. Oh, there's this is from the I think it's 1896 movie, which you can find on YouTube, which is a little under an hour long, and it's obviously 1896. Yeah, yeah. The films of that era are the closest way we have, other than literature and art. So, but the real closest way we have of looking at people of that era, because people who are in those movies themselves have, memories of earlier times. So I do recommend watching this. And it is a little slow, but it is true to the story, certainly. Okay. This is the actor who played him in that film. What's his name? Rip Van Winkle with Thomas Jefferson in the title role. Okay. That's the name. So, in the title role, done into motion pictures in the Catskill Mountains at the locations mentioned by Washington Irving in his sketch. A better idea of Rip than his words can convey. Okay. Oh, Rip Van Winkle is, we know, very popular again in modern culture. Here's Rip Van Flintstone returning to his wife and his friend, and there's his dog, or dinosaur in the case of the Flintstones. This is very clever. This was probably everyone's introduction to Rip Van Winkle, at least in the States. Here we go. Here's some of the statues commemorating him. Uh, the one of him standing is up in the Catskill Mountains. Seen that. And the one of him laying down is at is near is near Washington Irving's estate, Sunnyside. It's not directly on the estate. This is pretty much in public domain. You don't even have to go into the estate to see it. It's right there. And I had better pictures of it from years ago, but that's on Longo camera. Okay, here he is. And here he is in older age. He did live to be 76. He had a pretty long life for that time. Here's another penguin version of it, of my book. Here's another, Will Moses's version. And now we're in Sleepy Hollow, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Here's the Johnny Depp version, and there's a 1980 version of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow made for TV with Jeff Goldblum, who looks like he's physically perfect to play that role. And I actually like that version better than the Tim Burton version with Johnny Depp and Christina Ricci. And it's very visual, the Tim Burton version, but I feel like some of the visuals kind of overwhelm the actors a little bit, so you don't really get the full breadth of their performances. But it's a fun movie to watch. It's not my favorite Sleepy Hollow though. Um, okay, I'm gonna now go on and take a deeper look into Sleepy Hollow though. which is his other great tale, of course, which may or may not be a ghost story. The ending leaves the door open to the possibility of an actual haunting with, a sort of smile at the reader. The story of the headless Hessian soldier astride his rearing horse who leaves his church graveyard on a nightly quest to find his head is regarded as the first great ghost story in American literature. Like Rip Van Winkle, it is retold endlessly through pop culture. Even if you've never read Irving, you most likely know these two stories. Both are part of our cultural narratives, which we tell ourselves in our heritage, both internationally and generationally. Ichabod Crane is the indigent local schoolmaster. In the fashion of the times, the families put up the schoolmasters in their homes. They take turns and they have to feed them. They have to keep them for 1 week, and then the schoolmaster goes on to another household until they run out of households and it starts again. Um, Rip is described as traveling between households with his earthly possessions bound up in a handkerchief. His presence in the community as an extra man isn't of much note to the locals until he sets his sights on the beautiful daughter of the richest man in town, old Baltic Van Tassel, the father of Katrina Van Tassel, a man who moves about his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. Ichabod, of course, catches the eye and ears of Brombones, who's been planning to marry Katrina himself. And this sets in place one of the most famous chases in literary history of someone of Ichabod Crane being terrorized by the ghost of the Headless Horseman, who may or may not be a supernatural entity, or he may be, of earthly creation. Um, the Hessians, the Hessian soldiers, soldiers they're referencing were a group of mercenary soldiers who were employed by the British Army. Um, the Rip Van Winkle, I mean, not, excuse me, Ichabod Crane throughout the narrative is the thing I noticed about him is he's very focused on food, endlessly on food. And the narrative features great descriptions of the abundant fields and farms that they have there. The description of the food in the Van Tassel household is mouth-watering. And it seems, and this Katrina Van Tassel herself is often given these food-like descriptions of her beauty. She's plump. It makes it sound like she's you know she's for dinner or something. The way they talk about her, the way he focuses in on her plump arms and so on. But he is it does look like she's responding to his his presence until, of course, Brombones notices. Of course, it culminates in uh, Ichabod Crane being chased out of town, and he's never seen or heard from again, supposedly. Although some people, there is some talk later on in the story that he actually was spotted. So whether he's disappeared or not is questionable. Let me see. And this is Sunnyside. So this is Sunnyside on current time, which is really very pretty. That is a beautiful part of New York State. Here's the interior, which they keep, they want it to appear as it did 150 years ago, certainly. Oh, now we move on to Nathaniel Hawthorne, so who I would like to do a separate talk on, but I do want to just dwell on a few of his little bit of his background. He was descended from the original judge in the Salem witch trials, Justice Hathorne. So Hawthorne added a W in his name to separate himself from that history later in life. Obviously wrote The Scarlet Letter. He wrote House of the Seven Gables. He wrote a lot of short stories, which I think are of great interest and I'd like to talk about more in the future. I am going to recommend a few of his short stories to read. So I'm going to recommend Wakefield which is set in London and is based on a true story. It's not supernatural in theme, but it definitely has an underlying creepiness. It's about a man who one day goes out to get some milk or just to take a walk and doesn't return to his house for 20 years. Again, there's that 20-year number. And when he does return, he's living a few blocks away from his wife in London, and they don't see each other at all. And then he does suddenly reappear. So it is really weird story, but it's worth reading, and it's actually been the basis for a recent film called Wakefield, which is, of course, they make it a lot more dramatic, but it it is an interesting tale in his hands. So yeah, and that's it for today. Oh, what do I? Oh yes, here. I just want to throw these in. These are from a friend of mine, and she is an illustrator. She's actually won 2 Caldecott Awards for her children's books. Her name is Yuko Shimizu. She took these a few weeks ago down in Riverside Park at the Hudson River when it was really frozen. We could not take her little dog down there. She has a Chihuahua, but she went down there on her own and took these wonderful photos. So, okay.
All right, thank you.